Alright guys, I'm going to show you how I replace my transmission fluid, gasket, filter, and 13-pin electrical connector. First thing I did was get the front of my car on jack stands. Safety is really important. Be warned, I did this very carefully and properly. Safety is really important. I used a hydraulic floor jack and lifted up the car from the front jack points. You have to remove the bottom engine pans, the first and second coverings. I removed the first part of the engine cover before using the jack, but if you can't reach, you can jack up the car first. I used wheel chocks for extra safety on the rear wheels. To remove the covers, I used an 8mm standard hex socket and removed these 6 bolts. To remove the second part of the engine cover, I removed another 6 8mm bolts located here. After both covers are off, I was able to get to the transmission fluid drain plug. I removed the plug with a 5mm Allen bit on my socket wrench. I made sure the oil pan is large enough to capture all the oil and let this drain for 5 to 10 minutes. It's important to remember how much oil came out. Once there was no more oil draining, I removed the 6 bolts that hold the transmission pan in. The bolts were Torx T30, which are attached to a little clamp that holds the pan in place. This is what the clamps look like. Be careful when removing the pan, as there is probably still some oil left and it may be hot. Once the pan is out, I made sure the pan and magnet have been cleaned really well, and don't even allow a speck of dust into the pan. I used a microfiber cloth to clean it. This is also when I replaced the transmission drain plug, which I torqued to 20 Nm, and installed the new gasket. Before installing the pan back into place, replace the filter. The filter just comes out by pulling downwards. Install and press the new filter up into place. I now install the pan back into place and tighten the clamps and bolts, again with the Torx T30, with about 8 Nm torque. I've installed 5 bolts and left the 6th one out for now, since this is where we need to remove the 13-pin connector from. You can just install the 6th bolt if you don't want to change the connector. This may not be required for you, but it can prevent having to do this in the future, and the part is cheap anyway. To replace the connector, I went over to the passenger side and started removing the 13-pin electrical connector, which is known to leak due to worn O-rings and cause transmission slipping. To get to this connector, I had to remove the heat plate covering it. It's attached to a bracket that holds both the transmission pan and the heat cover. I removed this bracket using a Torx T30 socket. I gently pulled the heat plate out and uncovered the connector. I removed it by turning the yellowish connector counterclockwise. I had to be careful and gentle not to damage or crack the plastic. Once I heard the connector click, I was able to gently pull the connector out of the socket. To remove the actual connector holder or socket, I had to loosen the 7mm screw holding it in. Be very careful not to bend or damage the screw. Depending on its age and position, it may break, get stripped, or may give other kinds of trouble removing it. The bolt won't fall off, it's actually attached to the plastic holder. So once it's loose, gently pull the socket out. Here you can see the old and new side by side and the 2 O-rings. Make sure you remember the position of the connector lip and make sure the new one is in the same position before reattaching. I checked the socket and made sure I have both 2 O-rings and nothing got left behind. You can clean the socket with some engine parts cleaner as well. Reinstalling the new part can be a little tricky, so be really careful when installing it. There is only one way it can go in, and the pins must match the holes in the connector. Gently press the part all the way in. It must be tight and secure. Reattach the 7mm center bolt. Warning, be extremely careful at this point because you can easily over tighten and damage the connector or the electrical conductor plate inside the transmission. Only hand tighten this and don't really use any force at all. Finally, reattach the cable connector. Match the pins when installing. The connector grips the cable, and as you turn the plastic lip clockwise to close it, it will fully grab and attach the cable connector. If it doesn't, make sure the pins are aligned properly. Once the connector and cable are fully in place, you can put the heat shield back on and the 6th clamp and bolt that we left out earlier. That's the final bolt that holds the transmission pan in. Lastly, I refilled the transmission oil from the engine bay. In the engine bay, remove the engine covers. You can do this by removing the air ducts which come out by pulling them towards me. And then I removed the front part of the engine cover which came out by pulling up and towards me. Lastly, the engine cover, the main engine cover just pulls up. The transmission oil can be filled in this filler hole, located near the rear of the transmission, close to the passenger side windshield. Don't get this mixed up with the engine oil dipstick hole. To access the transmission hole, use a screwdriver and break off the red clip that holds it in place. Use a funnel and add the same amount of fluid that came out previously. Use a dipstick to verify that there is enough oil. There's a cold and hot measurement on the dipstick which should let you know if the fluid level is correct, and let the car run in reverse and drive in the other gears for 20 minutes to get the transmission oil circulating. You can put the car back together now, put all the covers back in, and close up the engine bay. Hopefully this video helped you out. Let me know, leave a like or comment. Thank you.